Good morning, everybody, from London. It's quite early in the morning here. I don't know if anybody else here is in Europe, but it's, as I said, 06:47. I'm going to share this presentation with you. And as George said, I'm a guitarist and composer and a researcher, and I'm based in London, where I have already said it's quite early in the morning. And these are some of the things that, well, it says some recent developments in the application of spectral resources, but really I'm only really going to talk about one development, simply for brevity of things being 20 minutes. I'm sure that everybody here at this symposium knows many things about the resources of the natural series of overtones, but it wouldn't hurt just to recap perhaps a couple of those, just so that we're all on the same page and speaking about the same thing. What's written out here is the overtone series of C, a very low C, from the first partial, the fundamental, up to the 20th partial. And one way of considering this series is to learn or understand the intervals that are created, i.e. the second partial is the octave above the fundamental, and the third partial is the octave and the fifth, and so on. Or one can consider it as a set of frequencies. And if you do that, what you realize is that each term in the series can be produced by simply adding the frequency of the fundamental again. Another way of expressing that is to do so in terms of ratios or vibration ratios, where what we're saying here, for example, is that the second partial vibrates twice every time the fundamental vibrates once. That's another way of saying that its frequency is double, and that is the same as transposing things by one octave, and so on in that fashion. So the frequency of any term in the harmonic series can be calculated simply by either addition of the frequency of the fundamental or by multiplication of the frequency of the fundamental. And this gives rise to some interesting properties in that it's odd number partials that get you new notes, and even number partials are octave transpositions. And the mechanism that produces that is thus that if you have two consecutive terms like 4 and 5, when you transpose them up by an octave, they will become terms 8 and 10, and in between them will be a new note at an odd number position in the series. And that's how this series proliferates off into infinity. Theoretically, is an infinite series of pitch division. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the St deviations that are above these notes in this diagram. These are deviations from 12-tone equal temperament, 12 EDO equal temperament, like on the modern piano, in St, 1/100th of a semitone being 1 cent. These are the things that I'm going to say spectralism is about for the purposes of this talk, and I think it's probably a fair overview of the things that spectralism was at least concerned with. One thing that I'm going to do, which perhaps is slightly unusual, is to include Radulescu in the names of the sort of classic spectralists. There are famous papers. There's a very famous paper that was published in Tempo in the UK, Cambridge University Press, which refers to Radulescu as the other spectralist. He's often been left out, but I'm going to include him in the under the banner of the classic spectralists. And here are some interesting things that two of the leading lights of spectralism said about the discipline. What we're going to discover, or what I'm going to show, is some development in these resources. But a thread that runs through all of this is this fascination with the stuff of timbre and the stuff of sound, and what is possible coloristically by considering the inner life of pitches. And what I mean by the inner life of pitch is demonstrated in this diagram, which is a diagram that I created using a piece of software called Spear. And this is a single note on the guitar. I just played a low E, and this is what's happening inside that note. I played one note, the lowest E string, and this is what the analyzer says is going on. And what this diagram is like a graph. Time is running horizontally, and pitch in hertz is running vertically. And these stacked lines are the partials of the overtone series of this low E, and the depth of their color shows how prevalent they are in the sound of the guitar. So really, this is a diagram of timbre, because what's happening inside a single note is the overtone series is happening all the time, and which partials of it are more prevalent than others is really the phenomena of what we refer to as timbre. That goes towards contributing to the kind of sound that an instrument makes, or that a variety of instruments make when they play the same note. They have different timbre. And so this is a diagram of a low E on the guitar, seen from inside the inner working of this pitch. Gerard Griset was a leading light of spectralism. I'm sure everybody knows lots about Griset. And I'm going to show you his use of these analytic techniques in a piece, Partials, which is from his really large cycle of works, L'Espace Acoustique. This is a classic approach to spectral resources, which has become to be termed instrumental additive synthesis. In Partials, Griset doesn't use a guitar, he uses a trombone, and I've drawn here on the left-hand side the spectrum of a trombone, low E, and then if I put some color analysis on this, you can see that what Griset has done is subjected this to analysis in an analyzer, not like Spear. I assume he had a computer that filled the whole room back in the 70s, but the ones that are most prevalent in his analysis, he orchestrates out into the ensemble. And you can see the start of that process, at least, in my color-coded diagram here, where things are orchestrated out in the right register across the ensemble, and the trombone, supported by the double bass, is holding this low E, the fundamental of the piece. I wanted to say something about Radulescu, because Radulescu is really, really related very directly to the composer that I'm going to talk about and show you this spectral development. Christian Mason has a soft spot for Radulescu, as do I. And I just wanted to explain one facet of the concept of sound plasma, which is a very important part of Radulescu's very personal musical style. This is a diagram, again, of a spectrum of C. And for his piece, Subconscious Wave, which is for guitar and pre-recorded digital sound, what Radulescu does is he retunes the strings of the guitar to the cent deviations of various partials of this overtone series of C. And so he creates a guitar that, when you play the open strings, is a spectral emanation of C. But he doesn't worry too much about dogmatically retaining the register of these partials, like, for example, in Griset. It's the color, it's these cent deviations that he wants, because what happens in this piece is the guitarist only plays natural harmonics, never frets a note normally, he only plays natural harmonics. And in that way, he's treating, Radulescu is treating this set of 6 partials of C, which are the open strings, as fundamentals in their own right, to define 6 new overtone spectra by playing natural harmonics on each string. And this phenomena is a really important ingredient in sound, the creation of sound plasma. And in his beautifully idiosyncratic English, Radulescu has a term for this process, which he calls it the emanation of immanence. And this is a very important part of his harmonic language. So the composer that I wanted to tell you something about today is Christian Mason, a good friend of mine, a composer based in the UK, living in London. And he has a great interest in spectral insights, he calls them. He doesn't say that, he doesn't say that I'm a spectralist, but he says that spectral insights are one of the most important parts of my musical language. And I'm going to demonstrate that, and in one way, I'm going to demonstrate an idea that he came up with that shows us perhaps a way that we can develop the use of these spectral resources. So the piece I'm going to tell you about is a string quartet from 2019, which Christian wrote for the Ardites. And I think one thing that probably freed him to, well, you'll see in a minute about these tuning things, that I think one thing that freed him to write in the way that he did and come up with this stuff is that he was writing for the Arditi Quartet, because, well, we all know their reputation for excellence in new music. And I think that if he had been writing in a vacuum on his own, and this hadn't been a commission, he might not have come up with this idea because, as we're going to see, the matters of tuning amongst the ensemble by ear are many and extremely challenging. So I'm going to show you the background to how this piece works, and then I'm going to describe a deployment of this technique in each of the 4 movements. And this piece is using what I've termed polyspectral modality. And the way that Christian creates this polyspectral mode is by combining together 2 overtone spectra, which are a minor third apart. And the minor third being a really important interval in Christian's language. It's one of his favorite intervals. And so in the top diagram on this page, you can see a spectrum of C from the 8th to the 24th partial. And then in the second diagram on the page, you can see the same range, the 8th to the 24th partial, of a spectrum on E flat, being a minor third apart. And if you layer these 2 spectra together, you get a very, very large spectral mode, a microtonal mode, which is displayed in the third diagram at the bottom of the page. And underneath that third diagram, which is the spectral mode, you can see the sort of implied root of each one of the pitches in the mode and how it all fits together. And Christian has made, I suppose, a concession to practicality in some senses, that the ones that I just underlined in red are the ones that he retains the cent deviations of and is very precise about wanting the cent deviations of those pitches. The others he allows to be equally tempered. Like, for example, the 9th partial shouldn't be equally tempered, it should be 4 cents sharp, and the 12th partial should be 2 cents sharp. But those ones he makes a concession to. But these ones that I've underlined are his favorite partials, the pure third, the 11th, 13th, 14th, and so on. And he's really particular about that, and we'll see that as we go along in the piece. So I'd like to tell you something now about how he deploys this mode across 4 movements. And to start with some textural analysis. This piece displays Christian's predilection for drone and for melody. And what we see here at the beginning of the piece is some drones in the cello, first on E flat, very important, this starts on E flat, and then moves on to C. And around that, the viola has a weaving melodic line, weaving around the pitches of the drones. Over the top are some spectral emanations in the violins, very high harmonics in the violins. Like here, for example, at the end of the first page. This is sounding a B flat, a 31 cents flat, 31 100th semitone flat, being the 7th or the 14th partial of the C that the cello is playing. If I highlight the cello C there. And so this spectral emanation is directly related to the fundamental of the drone that's in play at the moment, producing this slightly flat B flat. And Christian labels it C, 7th harmonic. And over the page, we see the same process happening again. Now we have an equally tempered B flat in the violins, or in the violin. And this is not the 5th partial. I think there's a mistake here in the score. That should say 6th. And the drone is E flat. So this harmonic is corresponding to the drone again. This is from the E flat spectrum, a good approximation of the 6th partial. And this process repeats itself as the drone moves back onto C. Here now in red again, the harmonic goes back to the slightly flat B flat. And so with this process of 2 colorations of the same pitch, one being equally tempered and one being 31 cents flat, are being 2 pitches taken directly from the mode for these spectral emanations, and underneath in the cello are the roots of these pitches being used as drone pitches. Meanwhile, in the viola, this melodic material is weaving around. Turning our attention to the second movement, we see a similar kind of texture. We have a drone in the cello. This time the drone has a natural harmonic in it, fluttering on the 5th partial of E flat. And some melodic material in the viola, and more supporting emanations in the violins, very, very high in the violins, 1 octave above written pitch and 2 octaves above written pitch in the violin. If I bring up the same color coding analysis, we can see a slight change to the harmonic thinking. This whole page is on a drone of E flat. And the melodic material in the viola is constructed, again, pitches from the mode, but now mixing different implied roots with the drone. The first phrase of the melodic material is built from one pitch from the E flat spectra and two pitches from the C spectra, and all held, or underpinned, I should say, by an E flat drone in the cello. And this is an interesting moment because it shows two colorations again of one pitch. The first pitch here in the viola is a naturally tuned, a pure third, the G down, 14 cents flat. And here's an interesting tuning moment because the viola player can get the tuning of that pitch, if they're not exactly sure, from the drone in the cello, because the drone in the cello is fluttering onto this fifth partial, producing the natural third. And then when this G comes back again in bar 3, the G circled in red, this is a tempered G, being a good approximation of the 6th or 12th partial of C. So we see two kinds of G, one slightly sharper, the one in red being slightly sharper than the one in green. If we continue that analysis into the next phrases, we can see yet another interesting development. Now, a very simple process happens with the drones. We have 2 bars on each drone, and we can see that the melody is composed mostly of pitches that are the same as the drone, or from the same spectra as the drone. But there are some overhanging ones, like C on the 3rd bar of the page in the viola that hangs over from the C drone, and the B flat down in the 4th bar of the page, which is a preemption of the movement of the drone. These notes circled in blue are pitches from outside of the mode. And this is quite an important feature of Christian's music, is that he is, how should I say, methodical, but not systematic. And he's not dogmatic about his resources in the way that Radulescu wasn't dogmatic about register with his partials. If Christian feels that a certain color is needed and it comes from outside of his mode, he feels completely able to do that. And these pitches in blue are examples of those outliers used to create melodic shape. An interesting insight comes if I show you an equally tempered reduction of these phrases that we've just analysed. And in fact, this is quite closely related to Christian's compositional practice. He often improvises melodies over drones, and often at the piano. He is also a very fine violinist, and so has a very good insight into writing for strings. But when I was talking to him about this piece, he said, oh, I started this movement by improvising these drones and improvising these melodies at the piano, and then choosing the colors of the pitches from my mode to get the right sort of microtonal inflections. So this is an equally tempered version of what we've just seen written out for piano. And if I bring up some partial analysis, we can see these different colorations of the same pitches. The first G there being the 10th partial of E flat with minus 14 cents, and the G in the 3rd bar being plus or minus 0. The 12th partial is C. Another interesting one that's harder to spot is the A flat in bar 2 being 41 cents sharp, the 13th partial of C, and the A natural in the 4th bar being 49 cents flat, the 22nd partial of E flat. And this is interesting because the difference between an A flat up by 41 cents and an A flat down by 49 cents is very little, but on the recording, I've linked to it at the end of the presentation, you really can hear a difference. The Arditi have been so careful to tune these spectral pitches, and not playing them as harmonics where they reliably produce their own tuning, but as fingered pitches by ear. It really is an extraordinary achievement. The third movement is really a Christian special, where this mode is projected in time and developed in time in a very process-driven way, using the whole quartet as a super instrument. And again, I've done a reduction of this to show what's going on. The mode is played as a scale figuration across all 4 instruments, and after a certain number of repetitions, we get a new note. So the C natural with the blue arrow is added. That's a pitch from the mode. And then when we return to the bottom of the scale, the last pitch has been eliminated. So now we're starting on F sharp down. And again, the process repeats itself. So now after a few repetitions, we go up to a D, and then we've lost the F sharp down and we start again on a G. This is a classic technique that Christian uses in lots of his pieces to display and project in time his harmonic material. And that is quite a spectral hallmark, I must say, developing these things, making them alive through a process-driven view of time, a slowly evolving process. To finish my overview, I will just say very briefly about the fourth movement. We've seen two movements starting with drones on E flat, and now we see, and moving on to C, and now we see a movement starting on C, the lowest string of the cello, with Christian's favorite chord, C major with a sixth. And again, it's the same texture, drone in the cello, emanations in the violins, and melodic material from the mode in the viola. So we've seen this process of moving from E flat drones onto C drones, and C makes a lot of sense for a string quartet because it's the lowest, it's like the fundamental of the ensemble, the lowest open string. But a question of why E flat? Well, I said one reason earlier, which was that Christian loves the minor third. But another reason, he told me, is because of this piece. This is the Adagio from Beethoven's string quartet, second string, the number 12 from Opus 127, the second movement, Adagio. And here we see a really interesting chord. E flat drone in the cello, D flat in the viola, B flat on the violin, and another D flat. A spectral chord, almost. And Christian thought to himself, well, what if Beethoven hadn't bothered making this dominant resolve onto A flat? What if he had kept on this chord for ages and ages and ages? And what if he'd tuned the seventh naturally, a pure seventh, minus 31 cents? Then what would that have been like? And that was one of the inspirations behind this piece. And so the development of this polyspectral mode could perhaps in some ways be traced back to Beethoven. And that leads to an interesting question about how much Beethoven knew about the overtone series. And perhaps we could have a discussion about whether Beethoven was in fact the first spectralist. But maybe that's a discussion for another day. Here are some references, Christian's catalogue, a recording of the piece, and some writings by Grisey and Radulescu. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Koji?
Thank you, Dr. Kerr, for your insightful presentation and in-depth explanation on three composers from different cultural background. Much of your presentation was focused on Mason's music, and he's the only living composer among three. The topic of this symposium is about contemporary music research, present and future. Maybe I'd like to ask a question about Mason's music first. Is that okay for you?
Yes, please. Yep.
Yes, actually, you explain many things already, and I prepared a few questions, but I try to frame in different ways. I read his program note of the piece you explained right now, and it's what's interesting because it's related to the idea of Buddhist philosophy of living in the moment, or experience of being in the present. Maybe if you have something, if you know something about this, his composer philosophy or about this concept, maybe he can explain.
Yes, I can. I can say something about Christian's feelings about that. Yes, if that would be interesting. I think that Christian has a great interest in non-European cultures and in non-European musics. He has a great interest in overtone singing traditions from around the world, for example. He has a big piece of a string quartet also, which is modeling the effects of Tuvan overtone singing. He often thinks about, as you were saying, about these Buddhist philosophies of sort of living in the moment. I think an interesting, perhaps, reflection of that is his willingness to be non-dogmatic with his systems. He's very open to moment-to-moment continuity decisions when he's deploying his resources. And often will make a decision, based on, in this moment that's right. And because his music relies quite a lot on structural lines, he has this system of drones that are often for certain set periods of time, and they're very often Fibonacci lengths. And he has these structural lines that are based around drones. And so the substructure is extremely cohesive. And I think that allows him to create a surface texture that lives in each moment, and allows him to incorporate materials from outside and his interest in music from other cultures, perhaps, and evoke other kinds of things, and particularly in terms of non-Western melodic shapes. Most of his melodic shapes are inflected with these spectral emanations that he always talks about coming from his experience of overtone singing, and also his experience of playing the theremin, for example, and playing the saw. He's quite good on the bowed saw, and so he's quite used to these sort of infinite pitch spaces. And I think that an interest in those things is probably where or how that deployment matches up with a sort of Western idea of a very structured underpinning to the composition. And I think that's what makes it successful in some ways, that these two things are coexisting. In the background, he's interested in eternity, the concept of eternity, and that's shown in, he views time often in a cyclic way, and there's often cycles of drones going on and cycles of pitch areas. But on top of that, because that structure is so well defined and rooted in a sort of a large scale view, a sort of eternal view of musical time, on the small scale and on the foreground, he can really afford to, as you said, live in the moment and make decisions that best suit the minutiae of the continuity. Like, for example, my blue pitches in the second movement. They are done for voice leading purposes in that melodic shaping. And so, but because everything else is so clearly defined in this harmonic landscape of this mode, this polyspectral mode, they work and they don't diminish the strength of the thing.
So the blue lines which you marked showed Mason actually protecting his intuition with his organized materials.
Yes, right? That's right.
Yes, and then maybe he's showing about a beauty of imperfection as well.
I think that's right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and what's interesting is in that moment when you get a blue pitch in that second movement, the very next thing that happens is all three of the melody instruments, the viola and the two violins, they line up on the same partial of C. So it's like you have this sort of intrusion of one note for a purpose of voice leading or melodic shaping, and as you said, the beauty of imperfection. And then you get this sort of coalescing of these three lines to sort of reassert. I think it does it on the F sharp down partial of C, on the 11th partial or 22nd partial, and sort of reassert the mode. Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you so much. Yes, that was actually my question, because I was just wondering if in his piece you can find any spontaneous or improvisational section, because I saw one interview on YouTube. He talked about he doesn't always stick with his plan.
No.
And so
one thing that's kind of interesting is he often produces materials by improvising, and then applying the inflections that he wants to the shapes that he's made by improvising. But also in terms of his planning of his compositions, I haven't got a diagram here to show you, but he makes these he's quite a talented visual artist, and he makes these incredibly beautiful and really detailed structural plans of his pieces. And we were discussing one of them the other day, and I said, "Oh, your plan." He's got a piece called Noctilucence, which is for chamber group and is extremely beautiful. And for that, there's this gorgeous plan that he wrote. And I said, that plan's really interesting, but I'm not sure that I see how it all read. And he said, "Oh, well, they're not to be followed. They're just to get things going. And and then if you get stuck, you can go back to if you run out of spontaneity, you go back to your plan." Because I think one of the challenges of composition is that between having an idea and then writing it out and making a piece, there's quite a big gap between one piece of spontaneity and the next piece of spontaneity can be quite far removed from each other. So if you have an idea that, you know, I want this kind of gesture for orchestra, it could be a week before you have to have the next bit of spontaneity, because you spend that whole time working out what the orchestration should be, how does everything balance together, you know, how many people should play to get the right effect. And then you need another bit of spontaneity. And so Christian does spend quite a lot of time improvising, and often transcribes in, what's the piece called for big orchestra, small orchestra, Layers of Love. There's a solo which started as an improvisation and then was transcribed and now exists as a solo piece, as well as in this, embedded into this fully scored piece. But he said that his pre-compositional plans get the juices flowing for composition, but also serve as something to come back to if he goes off at a tangent and then has to find his way back. But yeah, there are quite a lot of examples of improvisatory-like materials. And one thing that's quite interesting is that in some of his other pieces, I've been to performances with him or played in concerts where, you know, there have perhaps been inaccuracies or, you know, a little bit of this or that or whatever. And he said, oh, it doesn't really matter, because, you know, what he was doing was using the right material. I don't really mind, you know, because it was the right effect, and it was the right gesture, and it had the right harmonic material, because you know, the instrument was set up in that way or something, in the right tuning. And he's very open to things that, you know, he spent months writing out, having an improvisatory nature. I think he's very open to that. I think he's very open to the idea that these things are alive, and that they exist while people are doing them, and that it's important to engage with that in a meaningful way.
I'd like to ask a last question. Do you pick 3 particular composers, and do you see any progression of their method using a spectral element?
Well, I think that I certainly do. And what I had hoped to do in this talk, but there wasn't enough time, was to also talk about a piece to compare what Christian has done by using these 2 spectra and putting them together, with a piece by Lisa Ilian, which uses an overtone series of a very low 11 hertz ground frequency, which is a slightly sharp F. And to show that she's making overtone spectra based on non-tempered fundamental pitches. But is there a connection? I think that if you listen, for example, to Radulescu's 4th and 5th string quartets, and then listen to particularly the first movement of Christian's piece that I've just shown, these really high spectral emanations in the first movement in the violins are really, really, really reminiscent of Radulescu. And you can really hear Christian's love of Radulescu. At the start of the 4th string quartet, Radulescu has these very, very high harmonics in violins that make what he calls a self-generative function, which is where the partials that are playing in 2 of the instruments add up to make the partial that's playing in the other one. For example, if you have the 10th and the 11th partials playing in 2 instruments, then another instrument will be playing the 21st partial, because 10 plus 11 is 21. And then somewhere there'll be the fundamental, because 11 take away 10 is 1. And that chord, 1, 10, 11, 21, is what Radulescu calls a self-generative function. And he considers them like tonic sonorities. And in some ways, what Christian is doing is having these emanations without having the rest of the function, but having the fundamental that emanation comes from as a drone. And I think that is very closely related to that aspect of what Radulescu did. Yeah, I think Radulescu has more direct lineage to Christian than Grise, for example, because Grise had. I mean, Christian loves Grise's music, as I do, but this use of analytic techniques, computer-driven techniques, is slightly less in line with what Christian does nowadays, because he seems to have more to do with this idea of creating well, Radulescu termed it sound plasma, a sort of living stuff out of these spectral resources, creating a textural situation that's reliant on timbre and multiple coloration of the same pitch through the higher particles of the overtone series. And so there is a really direct lineage between Radulescu and Christian. Yeah, I would say perhaps less so with Griset, apart from this sort of fascination with the interior pitches, the interior life of a pitch. Christian doesn't do it with technical analysis with computers, but in lots of his other pieces, like, for example, there's a piece called Rituals of Resonance, which is for a very large orchestra. The structural line for that piece is held in cellos and brass, and out of that pitch, to create vertical harmony, are spectral emanations across the rest of the ensemble. And that is similar to what Griset is doing, in the sense that it's orchestrating out the internal properties of the pitch that is forming the drone at that point into the rest of the ensemble. But Christian hasn't done it in a sort of technologically informed way. He's done it more in the way that Radulescu would do it, by use of ear and sort of spiritual feeling about what should be happening at that moment in the piece. So there is a connection with Griset, but it's not through this technological analysis. It's to do with this fascination with what is the physical stuff of timbre, and how can that be a resource? How can that be a resource of pitch? And how can you articulate that in time?
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. It's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Nakano. Thank you very much.
Should we open it up to questions from the audience? We have about 5 minutes.
Oh, great, great.
If you'd like to ask a question, you're very welcome to put your hand up, or you could write the question in the chat if you don't want to actually speak it out loud.
Have you got something, George?
I have. So I always have something.
I know.
I'm really fascinated by Radulescu's the sentence that you quoted very early on: "Enter the sound, play there, and from there."
Yeah,
that's Radulescu, isn't it?
That's what he said. Yeah, yeah.
And does that relate to his concept of sound plasma? Are they connected?
Yeah, yeah. I think they are very much connected. There's a really famous interview that Radulescu did with Bob Gilmore, which is called "Wild Ocean," and I really recommend, if people don't know that interview, they read it. It's very, very good. In that, Radulescu talks about the secret inner world of sound. And what he's referring to is the Overtone series and these spectral resources. And what he is, when he's talking about sound plasma, one of the things that I showed is this emanation of immanence. But another thing that he uses is sum and difference tones. He doesn't sort of use computer analysis, but you can calculate, if you know the hertz of two pitches, you can calculate the sum and difference tones very easily, and you can calculate how much they would beat against each other. You know, the difference in pitch in hertz gives you the amount of beating that you would get when you play those two pitches together, and that is an essential component of sound plasma as well. And one of the ways that he creates that is by setting up situations where, again, probably over a drone texture, using something like a sound icon, which is a grand piano on its side with little threads over each string, so you can bow the strings individually, and they're all tuned to a certain overtone series. Setting up a situation where there will be a drone in that, and then over the top, and very often it's in bowed strings. One of his most famous pieces is Das Andere, which exists in versions for cello and viola. And there's this set of pieces called Intimate Rituals. I think there are 11 of them. And he sets up situations where the drone will hold a certain set of overtones, and against that, the soloist will pick a set of overtones to play over the top that create a certain beating effect. Or interact with what's happening in the sound icon in a certain way, and that is part of what that's another ingredient in sound plasma. Yeah, and so that is directly taken out of what he called in that interview the secret inner world of sound. And one thing that's quite interesting is that he talked about, again in that interview, he talks about using the tuning of the bowed string instruments, not the double bass, but the ones that are tuned in fifths, to create adjacent spectra on two different strings, and use them as a sort of tonic sonorities, or combine them together to make something that you keep coming back to. If you look at his scores, often what he does is he defines a range of partials and a string that you should play them on. His scores are normally tablatures with say if they're for bowed strings, they're a 4-line stave, and each line is a string, and on each one he will, in each moment of the piece, they're usually time space, you know, one line is a minute or something, and within each portion of each line, he'll define a certain range of overtones that are available to be used on each string or on a string, and to create the certain amount of beating or the right kind of combination of overtones or the right emanation of imminence to get the kind of activity in the plasma that he wants. He talks about a sort of trembling plasma of sound. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, that was a bit long, wasn't it? Sorry.
Not at all, not at all. Okay, but because of time's winged chariot, we have to move on. So thank you very much, Sam, for your wonderful
thank you. It's a pleasure to present here. Thank you so much for organising this fantastic conference, George. Well done.
Thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for being involved. Thank you for getting up so early. So.